Evelyn had always believed that love, loyalty, and time could build something unbreakable. For 20 years, she had devoted herself to Daniel, creating what she thought was an unshakable foundation of family. Their life was structured, predictable, a marriage weathered by deployments, distance, and the quiet ache of missing someone who was never home long enough. But this time, something was different. When Daniel returned from his latest deployment, the warmth between them felt distant, diluted. His embrace, once comforting, felt restrained, his kisses hesitant. He moved through the house as if he were searching for something unseen, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her chest tighten with unease. Evelyn told herself it was just readjustment, that he needed time to settle back into the rhythm of home. But in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the air felt heavy, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The distance between them was no longer just physical, it was something deeper. Something unspoken, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt a whisper of fear creeping in, a silent warning that the life she had built might not be as solid as she had once believed. Evelyn had always found comfort in the little routines of marriage, the quiet clatter of dishes after dinner, the way Daniel always kissed her temple before bed, the sound of his deep, steady breathing beside her in the dark. But now, those small reassurances had begun to unravel. His breathing was lighter, restless, as if sleep never fully took him. His eyes, once warm and familiar, now carried a weight she couldn't name. That evening, as she folded laundry at the kitchen table, she watched him absently flipping through a stack of old documents, bills, receipts, nothing out of the ordinary. But then he stopped. His fingers hovered over a single sheet, his body going rigid. Evelyn felt the shift in the air before she even saw his face. When he finally looked up at her, his expression was unreadable, but his silence was damning. "What's this?" His voice was controlled, too controlled. Her heart lurched as her gaze dropped to the paper in his hand. A hospital bill, the one she had buried deep within the pile, hoping it would never resurface. But now, it had, and with it, the truth she had fought so hard to keep hidden had just found its way into the light. Evelyn could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a steady drumbeat of impending doom. Daniel's fingers clenched around the paper, his knuckles turning white, his eyes burned into her, demanding answers, but she had none to give that would make this right. "My brother's name is on here," he said, his voice eerily calm, too calm, "not mine." The words struck her like a blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, imagined ways she could twist the truth, soften the blow, but now that it was here, she had nothing. "Tell me it's a mistake," Daniel continued, his voice shaking, though his body remained rigid. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and blinding. She wanted to lie, wanted to beg, wanted to rewind time to a place where she could make a different choice. But she couldn't. The truth was a wildfire, already raging between them, consuming everything they had built. His bitter laughter cut through the silence. "A mistake?" His voice was raw. "No, Evelyn, a mistake is forgetting to lock the door. This is a betrayal." Daniel stood frozen, his breath shallow, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. His world had just collapsed in the space of a few seconds, reduced to ash by a single hospital bill. But nothing could have prepared him for Evelyn's next words. "He doesn't know." The confession slipped from her lips like a death sentence. Evelyn barely recognized her own voice, soft, broken, pleading. Daniel's entire body went rigid. His gaze flickered toward the hallway. Where there? No. His nephew played, blissfully unaware of the truth unraveling behind him. The weight of it pressed down on him like a vice, squeezing the air from his lungs. His son, no, his brother's son, was living a lie Evelyn had let him believe. The silence stretched unbearably, thick with everything neither of them could bring themselves to say. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "So you've been lying to both of us this whole time?" Evelyn shook her head desperately. "Daniel, I..." But he was already stepping back, his expression shuddering, his features cold. He turned without another word, without another look, walking out the door and taking every last piece of trust she had left with him. Days turned into weeks, then months, and Daniel never came back. No calls, no messages, no desperate attempts to fix what had been broken. Just silence, a vast, unrelenting void where he had once been. Evelyn had expected his anger, welcomed it, even, but not this. Not the way he erased her as if she had never existed. Then the papers arrived. A plain envelope, no note, no explanation, just the stark, unforgiving reality of divorce staring back at her in black ink. Evelyn traced the sharp edges of the document, her breath catching in her throat. There was no fight, no chance to plead or explain. Daniel had made his choice, and it was final. But the universe wasn't finished punishing her. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, slicing through the fragile quiet she had built around herself. A stranger's voice on the other end, calm, detached. "There's been an accident." Evelyn's knees buckled. The words blurred together, collision, unconscious, critical condition. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. Daniel. She grabbed her keys, running out the door, knowing, praying, there was still time. Because losing him completely was something she wasn't sure she could survive. The hospital air was thick with antiseptic and something heavier, grief. Maybe, or the weight of too many unanswered questions. Evelyn sat stiffly in the waiting room, her fingers clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The moment she had arrived, the nurse had given her that look, pity laced with hesitation. As if bracing for the worst. Daniel was in surgery. That was all they would tell her. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she tried to steady her breathing. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She had already lost him once. But at least then, he had been alive, somewhere in the world, even if he wanted nothing to do with her. But now, the thought of a life where he simply didn't exist at all sent a sharp, searing pain through her chest. She glanced up every time the doors swung open, expecting, dreading, a doctor to emerge with news that would change her life forever. Her mind replayed every mistake, every regret. She had betrayed him, he had walked away, and now, fate had stepped in with its own cruel, irreversible consequence. If he didn't make it, she would never get the chance to say she was sorry. The funeral was held on a quiet Sunday morning, the sky overcast as if mourning alongside them. Evelyn stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled tissue. She had thought she was prepared for this moment, that she had already lost Daniel long before today, but nothing could have prepared her for the finality of it. The way his name carved into cold stone sent a sharp, unbearable ache through her chest. People whispered around her, their voices a murmur of grief and speculation. She could feel their stares, the weight of their judgment. They all knew the truth now. The betrayal, the lie, the son who wasn't his. And yet, as she looked at the casket being lowered into the ground, she knew none of it mattered anymore. All that remained was regret. Thick and suffocating, she had spent years waiting for a chance to fix things, to explain, to make him see that despite everything, she had loved him, but now, there was no more time. The wind carried the soft sound of weeping, but Evelyn couldn't cry. She simply stood there, staring at the grave of the man she had once called her husband, feeling like she had buried a part of herself with him. Evelyn sat in the dim light of her kitchen, the air thick with silence, a single unopened envelope resting on the table before her. It had arrived that morning, a letter from Daniel, written before the accident. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, her breath shallow, as if opening it would unravel everything she had tried to keep together. For hours, she had told herself she wouldn't read it. What good would it do now? He was gone. No amount of words on a page could change what had happened. And yet, as the night deepened and the weight of loneliness pressed against her, she finally reached for the letter, tearing it open with trembling hands. Evelyn. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. Maybe I don't want to. But despite everything, I can't erase the years we shared, the love that existed before the betrayal, And I need you to know, no matter how much anger I hold, there is a part of me that never stopped caring. Not for you, not for him. Take care of him, Evelyn, no matter how this ends. He's still ours. Daniel. Tears blurred her vision. It was too late. Evelyn stood at the edge of the cemetery. Her fingers clenched tightly around the damp fabric of her coat. The wind howled through the bare trees, rattling the brittle branches like the ghosts of unspoken words. It had been weeks since Daniel's funeral, but she hadn't found the courage to visit his grave until now. The weight of his final letter still pressed against her heart, each word a wound she could never close. As she approached the headstone, she traced his name with a trembling hand, her breath hitching in her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. "For everything." She wished he could hear her, wished she could take back the choices that had led them here, to a love shattered, to a truth that had stolen their future. But no apology could undo the past. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A figure stood a few feet away, hands buried in his pockets. Her son, their son. He had come, too, though neither of them had spoken about it. Their eyes met, grief mirrored in his gaze, and for the first time, Evelyn wondered if forgiveness was possible. The reception hall hummed with quiet chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft melody of a string quartet. Evelyn sat at a table near the edge of the room, watching as her son laughed with his new wife, his smile genuine despite the absence of the man who should have been beside him. She had expected the day to be heavier, burdened by the weight of what had been lost. But as she observed him, standing tall, unshaken, she realized something. He had chosen to move forward, and perhaps, so could she. Her fingers traced the rim of her untouched champagne flute. Across the room, her parents sat in stiff silence, the tension between them thick with disapproval. They had never forgiven her for exposing the truth, for shattering the illusion they had built. But Evelyn no longer needed their acceptance. She had done what was right, and watching her son take control of his own life proved that. A hand touched her shoulder gently. She turned to see him, her son, his expression softer now. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. Closure didn't come with forgetting. It came with surviving. Life often forces us to make difficult choices, especially when faced with betrayal, loss, or the weight of painful truths. In today's world, where appearances and expectations can hold us captive, it's important to remember that honesty, even when painful, is the foundation of real freedom. Letting go of toxic relationships, standing up for what's right, and choosing self-respect over forced loyalty are acts of courage. You don't have to carry the weight of the past alone. Trust yourself, set boundaries, and remember that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about moving forward. Stronger and wiser than before.